Welcome back to another episode of my knitting podcast, and I'm really glad that you decided to join me today. I've had a really busy couple of weeks, so it feels really nice to finally sit down and discuss my projects with you, and I hope it's going to be interesting. Please grab a drink, grab your knitting or crafting project, and let's get started. And if by any chance you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe so you don't miss my future videos. I kind of have to warn you now that this episode will have a really uncharacteristic, at least for me, amount of acquisitions because I've been to H&H Cologne and came back with a lot of new information and a lot of goodies. I have to be honest with you, this trip was really overwhelming to me. It was my first knitting festival. Even though it was more of an expo than a traditional knitting festival, it was still a lot to explore and handle and process in just 3 days. Plus, the venue itself was absolutely huge. It was 2 floors, with the first floor mainly reserved for sewing and embroidery, so like fabrics, notions, and thread, everything like that. And then the second floor was mainly knitting. So I just got really overwhelmed, especially with the amount of people I was meeting and like different things I had to like go to. So I ended up taking a lot less footage than I wanted to, but I was so overloaded most of the time that it was hard to remind myself to actually like take out my camera and capture what I was seeing. But it was 100% worth it. And I'm definitely going to come back next year and I will be prepared to capture more footage and in general be more organized during the trip. I think let's get straight into my finished objects now. And I have 3 for you this time. So 1 garment and 2 accessories, but let's start with the garment. It's my finished Upstream sweater. So despite my multiple issues with this pattern, which I discussed in the previous episodes, I'm still really happy with how the finished object and especially my modifications turned out. But to the surprise of absolutely no one, I did not finish it before my trip to Cologne as I really wanted to. I basically had an evening to knit an entire sleeve, the last pattern repeat on the body and the ribbing on the body, as well as block the finished sweater and hopefully having it be dry before I left. I realized pretty quickly that I would have to pull an all-nighter to get it finished, and I was really not in the mood to do that or thought it was a good idea right before I had to leave. So I just admitted defeat, and I'm kind of glad I did because I finished this project with 0 pressure, without a deadline, and it was just a really relaxing knitting experience towards the end. In general, my sweater, of course, looks like the Upstream sweater pattern, but it's mostly because of the stitch pattern, and everything else is heavily modified here because, as I said last time, I stopped following the pattern pretty quickly because I just couldn't decipher the instructions. So there is, first of all, no shaping on the neckline. I went straight into the raglan and skipped the short row shaping, but to make up for it, I actually added this like crescent-shaped kind of piece of fabric with German short rows before I started the ribbing at the bottom. It's really subtle, but I think it gives me enough extra length to differentiate between the front and the back. And another pretty substantial modification I made was to the raglan itself because I split for body and sleeves a lot sooner than the pattern suggested for my size, and my yoke is still pretty deep, but because I split sooner, I had a break in the pattern repeats and had to kind of come up with different stitches to cast on here in the underarm section for both the body and like the bottom section of the sleeve. And I ended up just doing 2x2 ribbing, and I think it's subtle enough and kind of blends into the overall stitch patterns. This sweater was actually really easy to block because this 2x2 ribbing section was kind of mimicking seams at the sides and at the bottom of the sleeve. So I was able to just lay it out exactly, fold it in half without, skewing the pattern or like having it twist or something. So I forgot to mention something in the last episode when I was talking about my second Lovisa cardigan, but a tiny, like teeny tiny modification I did for that cardigan is that I added 2 purl stitches, like 1 on each side of the body, just to kind of mimic a seam, again, for the purpose of easier blocking and like folding and handling. Of course, if you, for example, when you block it, you wring it too much accidentally, you might end up actually like biasing the stitches because stockinette is really stretchy. And this way, you know exactly where the seams are, and it's really easy to just fold it exactly in half. I actually wanted to add it to my Ivy blouse, but I forgot, and then it was too late. I knit too much of the body to just go back or like fix the stitches, especially in Mohair. Going back to the modifications I made for the Upstream sweater, another like substantial modification I made was to the decreases at the cuff. So this design doesn't have a standard tapered sleeve. Instead, it has a more rapid slope right towards the cuff, which gives it a wide shape, but still kind of cinches it in. I tried to mimic that with my own decreases because, of course, my stitch count and stitch pattern in general was a lot different. I started decreasing on the last pattern repeat. I was decreasing every fifth round, so I was doing knit two together and an SSK right where my ribbing section is. Then I actually continued the decreases on the ribbing itself in the cuff, and it gave me a really interesting shape. In general, the sweater has about 25 centimeters of positive ease on me, so it's really slouchy, really kind of comfortable to wear, and I think I need to add more contemporary pieces like this to my wardrobe because I find that with a lot of my outfits, I'm very kind of vintage coded no matter what I do. Like even if I'm wearing jeans and sneakers, I think because of my hair and like the general maybe color scheme I'm going for, I look really vintage or almost like retro. So pieces like this that are more contemporary and stylish are really useful and nice to have. So the yarn I used for this sweater was Como Grande by Lamana, and this yarn was sent to me by the brand, for which I'm super grateful because I really love it. It was an amazing, pleasant experience knitting with it. It's really soft, really matte, and feels luxurious when you knit with it. And in terms of weight and texture, I would say it's similar to Atlas by Sadness Garn, but again, it's much softer and it actually feels exactly like cashmere. Even if I were to do a blind test, for example, and touch a ball of 100% cashmere and this yarn, which is 100% merino wool, I don't think I would be able to tell the difference because it is exactly as lightweight and like plush and almost like whipped as cashmere. And unfortunately, the downside of this is that it pills exactly like cashmere, and I already had to depill it. I was wearing this sweater on and off for about a week, and I could see the small like loose pills starting to form, but to be honest, I don't really care. Pilling on fabrics like this subsides over time anyway, and it's not as dramatic once you wear the sweater for a bit and the fibers kind of settle, so I'm not really worried about it. And just a couple of final words about this pattern before we move on. Even though this is, of course, my personal opinion, I, again, personally didn't like it, and I rarely have a lot of like negative feedback about patterns, so it's kind of a unique experience for me, to be honest, but I don't like the way it's written. I don't like the way it's like formatted and the construction choices that were made for this design. So I personally wouldn't recommend it, especially if you want to buy the book exactly to knit this pattern. Maybe skip it, maybe wait for it to be released as a separate pattern. I don't want to say I would never knit a Rose knitwear pattern again, but I would be a bit hesitant to try out her patterns in the future. And I think what I need to do is that since I already have the book, I might just have a browse through it to see if the other instructions are written in the same manner or if that was an issue with me and that particular pattern. But in general, I can't unfortunately recommend it, which is a shame, but the finished object itself is a 10 out of 10 project. I really love it and I'm glad to have it in my wardrobe. Let's move on to my finished accessories, and the first one I wanted to show you is my Rikke Scarf, which I wanted to cast on as my travel whip for my trip to Cologne, but at the last minute, for some unknown reason, I decided to cast on a Sophie scarf instead. As you can see by the fact that the Rikke Scarf is all finished, it was a bad idea and a big mistake because for me, the Sophie scarf is the worst choice for a travel knit. I immediately got distracted and started messing up my increase rate. I had to rip back multiple times to reach my visible increase and start again, and at some point I was just ripping back more than I was knitting, so I just frogged the whole thing and went back to my original idea of knitting a Rikke scarf. And to be fair, the Rikke scarf is probably one of my favorite small scarf patterns out of all the ones I've tried and mentioned in my roundups. It's so easy to knit and it's much easier to keep track of your increases because they're kind of integrated into this eyelet motif, and because it's knit in basically ribbing, you can always see where you are, and it's much easier to count your rows than it is in garter stitch. This is also the second Rikke scarf I've knit. I absolutely love my first one, and I've mentioned it multiple times. Now I have another one in a different color scheme to kind of go with different outfits, and also this one turned out to be much larger, even though I used the same needle size, and the meterage I ended up using was about the same, but because these yarns are so different, they have a really different feel and look to them. And although I do highly recommend this pattern, I still have to mention that unfortunately, it's a bit confusingly written, so the beginning of the instructions is laid out in chart form, but for some reason it just switches to written instructions randomly, and you only have a chart going up about here, and then it just maybe assumes that you've memorized the repeat until then, and it just gives you a written instruction on what to do next. And it's not that bad because, first of all, this pattern is, again, super simple and is really easy to memorize and just keep going. But if you're a beginner, for example, or just somebody who is used to patterns holding your hand and having a visible sort of workflow all the way through, it might be a bit hard to kind of wrap your head around it. And it's a shame because otherwise I really love this pattern, and I feel like this is such an underrated design for a small scarf like this. Just as with the Sophie scarf, it's easy to modify it for different yarn quantities, and you can make it really short or like really large, but maybe keep in mind that the instructions might be a bit confusing at the beginning if you want to knit this. The yarn I used for this was Bluesky Fibers Skyland, and it's a very special yarn because it was brought to me by my friend Alona from the US as a souvenir, and it was a very fun experience knitting with this yarn. It's really interesting because it is extremely squishy and like springy. Also, it's shiny because of the silk content, but at the same time it also has alpaca, which gives it a really interesting fluff and like halo that really puffs up after blocking. And I guess my only gripe with this yarn is that it was giving me really wonky stitch definition when I switched to knitting the Rikke scarf. This yarn is really smooth and not sticky, so when you knit with it, the fibers and like the stitches don't have anything to grab onto, and because of that it's pretty stretchy and is kind of similar in terms of the fabric it gives you to superwash yarn, even though as far as I could research, it's not superwash. Of course, with blocking, everything fell into place, and I really love how this scarf looks in this yarn, but to be honest, I wouldn't use it for a garment if I had the chance. I'd probably stick to other options, but for a small accessory like this, it's perfect. And I used exactly one ball of this yarn because before I left for my trip, I knew I had to divide my yarn in half, but I didn't want to cut it in the middle. Since I usually double wind the skeins anyway, I just wound it without any like weighing or markers. But then when I was winding it a second time, I just put a marker exactly in the middle once it was 50 grams on the ball winder and 50 grams on the scales. And then when I reached that marker, I knew that it was time for me to switch to decreasing. And it's such a simple thing, but it was really convenient because, again, I don't have scales while I'm on the road. And before I talk about my other finished accessory, I have to rewind back to my trip because when I was at Cologne, I had a chance to meet a lot of teams behind yarn brands in person, and it was really nice to just get to know people and chat, learn about some new things coming out. And I just realized how much of a yarn nerd I'm becoming, and it was just, again, really overwhelming but extremely interesting. And one of my favorite discoveries at that fair was Rosarios. And I guess I should stress that this is not an ad, so I was the one who struck up a conversation with them just because I was really impressed by what they had to offer in their booth. And just to give you an idea of how varied their selection is, I have not one, but two little swatch books or whatever you call these things. And they're just, I don't know, about 40 different yarns in here. And it's really actually useful to have, especially for when I'm doing my roundups, because I really try to make sure that I keep my yarn suggestions varied and maybe different from what is proposed for a given pattern. But I just feel like I get stuck with recommending the same 3 yarn brands every time. So it's nice to have a bigger pool of reference. And also Rosarios gave me their summer yarns, like a little selection of their summer yarn to try out and give my feedback on, which I was really grateful for. Two of these yarns are already in a work in progress, which I will talk about later, but also this is where my second finished accessory comes in, and it's the Cutie Collar by Agatha Wilk. And this was such a spur of the moment cast on. I really didn't expect to make this, and this was also my first time doing a standalone collar. I've never knit this kind of accessory before, so I'm just really impressed with how it came out, considering that this is my first time knitting something like this. I mainly knit this to try out the Alfama linen from Rosarios, and I had one skein in a beautiful off-white, which I thought would be perfect for a small collar like this. So I just browsed Ravelry based on my meterage to find a hopefully free pattern, since this was mostly an experiment, and I found the Cutie Collar pattern, which I really liked, so I decided to give it a go. But even though it's a really well-written pattern and I do recommend it, it doesn't have gauge indicated anywhere, and it's kind of annoying because the pattern is written for a fingering weight plus silk mohair, and I was using, of course, a different yarn, so I wasn't sure that my tension would be suitable for this pattern, and I didn't want to end up with a collar that is much too big or like much too snug here at the neck. Because it was quite a small accessory, I decided to risk it, and thankfully it worked out, and I like the dimensions of this collar. But also I feel like, again, gauge is so important here, and you can probably tell that this collar is quite modified compared to the original pattern. And the first modification I did was adding short rows to it to make the back longer than the front and to make the kind of width of the shoulders a bit larger without adding too much length at the front. But I got carried away and ended up using way too much yarn for me to also be able to knit the I-cord edges and I-cord ties in the same linen. So this is all I have left, and you can probably tell that this is not enough. So I had to come up with a solution, and I didn't want to use another yarn in off-white because I felt like the clash in texture would make it look really scrappy, which is not the look I was going for. Instead, I decided to go in a completely different direction and used the yarn with a lot of contrast. I found some leftovers of Knitting for Olive Merino in my stash from my rosy sweater, and this is the color Licorice, so it's completely black, and I just decided to go for it and see how it looks. And I was really impressed with the fact that it absolutely elevated this color, and I think now it kind of reminds me of the accessories and vyshyvankas in some of our Ukrainian brands that are really modern and kind of luxury but still use a lot of traditional elements. I'm mainly talking about Gunya or Etnodim. They sometimes have these beautiful black and white pieces that have this really heavy contrast and have either black embroidery on white or white trimming on black, and it looks stunning. So I'm glad that my little experiment kind of looks like it was made on purpose and like I've drawn inspiration from those brands, which wasn't really intentional, but I really love it. So this was all for my finished objects, and now let's finally move on to my works in progress before I explode, because I love all of these. I feel like I've never had such a successful work in progress lineup. It's really hard for me to choose what to knit because I love them equally. And even the fact that I encountered a major hiccup with my first work in progress did not deter me. I'm still really, really happy with it. And it's my Norma Sweater by My Favorite Things Knitwear. And this was also a spur of the moment cast on because I was kind of ignoring this pattern for a while. I didn't really consider it because I have some mixed feelings about striped raglans, mostly because of this angular line the stripes have on the yoke. But I'm so glad I reconsidered because I'm enjoying it so much now, and I kind of owe this project to my friend Anya, who basically came up with the color combo I'm using, which is like my favorite thing about this sweater. So another brand I was really impressed with at HH Cologne was Eriu Ireland, which is like saying Ireland, Ireland, and I understand that, but it's just the name of the brand. Anyway, they have some beautiful, gorgeous wools in amazing jewel-toned colors, and the story and the philosophy behind the brand was really appealing to me. I ended up chatting with the owner, and she gifted me a skein of their Elements DK. This is the most beautiful blue I've ever worked with. I absolutely love it. Of course, it doesn't look as impressive now as it would have in a skein, but I, of course, had to cake it up because I wanted to start knitting with this so bad. Because I'm currently, honestly, at capacity when it comes to yarn quantities to use for shawls, I didn't want to use this one in a shawl as well. Instead, I wanted to have it as a contrast color in a colorwork project. So I once again started browsing through Ravelry to see what I can knit with this yarn as my contrast color, and for some reason I didn't consider any patterns that have more than one contrast color, and my kind of short list included the Upstream Sweater. So I was ready to go out and buy some new yarn for this, but then my friend Anya, with whom I was at a knitting Zoom date at the time, was like, you need to try and swatch for the Norma Sweater with this yarn. And I was not convinced at first, but she insisted, so I took the Cascade 220, which I already had in my stash, and tried to maybe see what other color to add to the mix. So for my first swatch, I tried mixing these three yarns. So of course the main color, I wanted to use the blue that inspired this whole project, and I tried to add this dark Cardiff Cashmere Classic to it. And although this combo looks beautiful just laid out like this, it was not working in the swatch because this brown was way too dark and just looked like a void in the colorwork motif. So my next choice was the other brown yarn I had in stash, which is Cotton Merino from Knitting for Olive in the shade Dark Cognac. And I mentioned my plans to knit a vintage blouse from this yarn in my previous podcast, so I was kind of hoping that it wouldn't work, but it worked so well. This color was exactly what I needed to make this combo work, but at the same time, this yarn is quite smooth and it doesn't have as prominent of a halo as the Eriu wool or Cascade 220, so I had to try and experiment more. So I ended up adding one strand of this silk mohair, which I've had in my stash for ages. This is Kid Seta tweed from Gepard Garn. And in theory, these two yarns could not have been more different, and you wouldn't think that they can be mixed together, but specifically for this color combo, it worked beautifully because I'm using two strands of this cotton merino and one strand of this silk mohair, and it gives it a really subtle marling effect or heathering effect. Plus the silk strand in this yarn is silvery, just as the heathering in the blue yarn, so they look really similar in terms of just the general base. I don't know how to explain it well, but when I see it in the final garment, it just looks really intentional, and the fluff that the silk mohair has really brings together this combo. The only, at that point, hiccup I encountered is the fact that even though this yarn is labeled DK and it has pretty much the same amount in 100 grams as the Cascade yarn, it is actually much thinner than a DK in my opinion. I would classify it as sport weight, or maybe it's just my tension, I don't know, but when I tried to use it in a single strand and add it to Cascade and to the mix I came up with using the cotton merino and the silk mohair, I found that this yarn was almost see-through in comparison, and it was just much too thin. So I had to make a tough decision to start playing yarn chicken right from the start and use it in two strands held together. And this really soured my enjoyment of this project until I came up with a solution to kind of stretch this yarn longer for all of the stripes I would need. Whoops, my camera overheated. I'm so sorry, but anyway, as I was saying, I tried to come up with a solution to make this yarn last longer because 100 meters approximately would not have been enough to complete all of the stripes I might need to finish the sweater, and I didn't want to cut any corners, so thankfully my solution worked. I just mixed it with the Lac Lamont in blue, which I was using for my Lovisa cardigan. What helped me was, first of all, the fact that I was holding two strands together, which meant I could just swap one of the strands and still kept the original blue in the mix. And also, since the stripes are pretty far apart, they don't really overlap and the gradient is not as noticeable. So this is how it looks together, and again, I think it worked out pretty nicely. Not that you can see it in the actual work in progress, because I had to frog a lot of my progress here. I was just flying through this knit up until yesterday when I tried it on and realized that it was coming out much too big. It was just way too large for me to consider it oversized, and especially the sleeves were way too wide. And I think because my yarn combo is so different from what the pattern recommends, the fabric is not as like flowy and drapey. And the worst thing about it is that I wasted 2 seasons of the Orville to knit this, and I can't really like rewatch them again. And sometimes you just waste good movies or TV shows for projects that don't work out, and it's kind of the sad part of knitting that nobody talks about. So I ripped back half a sleeve and half of my body length back to the point where this was still a raglan yoke, and I moved the split a bit farther up. So before, my split was under this stripe, and now as you can see it's above the stripe, and it fits me much better. Plus this pattern in general has a really dramatic raglan yoke, and I didn't want it to be that deep and dramatic. So far, the only other modification I've made here besides moving the split for body and sleeves further up was the collar. The sweater has a mock neck, and I instead knit a more classic folded collar, and it was mostly for practical reasons because I find that I can't really wear any of my sweaters with a mock neck when I'm filming because, of course, I have a mic which kind of clips to the collar and it's a bit heavy. So when I'm filming in my mock neck sweaters, it just ends up falling down all the time and I have to adjust it and it just doesn't look good. But also I just really like a crisp folded collar on a sweater. So I feel like this modification fits my version quite nicely, and I also went down in needle size from what was recommended in the pattern for the collar. So this is actually knit on 3mm needles, and even though it looked really beautiful and the stitches were really like straight from the start, I was afraid that it would be too stiff and too tight on me, so I did my first mid-project block just to be sure it evened out and kind of loosened up with blocking. So these stitches are not really my standard stitch definition. It's blocked, so this is why it looks so smooth. But honestly, seeing this blocked and beautifully smooth yoke made me want to keep going even more. It's really motivating me to continue with this project, and usually I don't find any like practical reason for me to do a mid-project block, but here I'm glad I kind of put my mind at ease regarding the collar. And knitting this Norma sweater has really inspired me to look for other color combos that include 3 different colors and maybe check out some of the patterns that I wasn't really considering before. And the one that fits this description the most is the Isla Shawl, which I ended up casting on right after I got back home and started the Norma sweater. And this is another pattern which I've been seeing everywhere, but wasn't really thinking about casting on myself. And I first had a change of heart when I saw the Bush and Bush display at HH Cologne and finally saw the finished object in real life. It kind of made me finally consider the Isla Shawl, but at the same time, I still felt like I don't have suitable yarn for it, or maybe, you know, having a blue stripe isn't really my thing because I don't really like light blue. But of course, knitting the Norma sweater was the final push I needed, and I have cast on the Isla Shawl and it's my favorite thing. I love it so much. Of course, I might be a bit biased because this is my work in progress, but I feel like this is absolutely stunning. I love my yarn combo and the color combo. I just adore it. And also, this is the most potato chippy pattern I've ever knit. You just can't put it down. It looks so much more complicated than it actually is because you just knit stockinette in stripes and add some slip stitches to create this houndtooth effect. It technically has a pattern repeat, but it's so simple to memorize that it quickly becomes a really mindless knit, which is at the same time super potato chippy because you always want to get to the next stripe and then to the next repeat and then to the next yarn, and it just grows and grows and grows until it's finished. And the combo of yarns I'm using for this is very different from what the pattern recommends, which is of course Biche and Bush Le Petit Lamb's wool. All of my yarns are a bit thicker, and I'm also using a larger needle size and knitting this in probably a larger gauge because I haven't made a gauge swatch for this. But I'm so glad I decided to pair these yarns and even thought about trying them together in one project because, as you can tell by how excited I am, I'm really loving it. So for my base white, I'm using this Seasons by Rosarios. It's a half cotton, half wool mix in a chainette strand. This is a very squishy and sort of springy yarn, and I'm really curious to see how it would behave in a garment, but this time, since I only had one ball of this as a sample, I decided to first try it out in a shawl. And for my brown stripe, I'm using Cardiff Cashmere Classic, which is exactly the same colorway way I tried to make work for the Norma Sweater, but even though it didn't work in that pattern, it somehow really works well here, mostly because I feel like these slip stitches are breaking up the stripe enough to not make it look like a block of dark yarn. And of course, I also have this blue in the mix, and this light blue is also from Rosarios. It's called Principe Real. I hope I'm not butchering this name too much, but it's too Portuguese for me to pronounce. It's a true summer yarn, so it doesn't have any wool in it. It's linen, cotton, and silk mix, and it's spun really interestingly, a bit rustic and really textured, but here you can't really tell that it's so textured because it mixes up with the other stripes. And because all three of these yarns are technically chainette yarns, it's a really fun experience to knit with them because they're so springy and pleasant to hold in your hands. Since I'm not really limited in terms of meterage for this project, I can make it as big as I want, and this is exactly what I'm aiming for. So the original pattern actually stops after 4 pattern repeats. So in my case, it's 4 blue stripes, but I'm actually aiming for 7 blue stripes, as on one of the projects I saw in the Ravelry finished objects for this pattern. That project also has a similar color scheme to mine, but with the blue and brown stripes flipped. And I'm sure that this is not the last Isla Shawl I'll be knitting, just because there are so many different yarn combos you can use and different color schemes you can come up with. So it's going to be really fun to experiment and maybe stash bust a little. And my next work in progress is something you have seen before, and it's my Ivy blouse, which I'm turning into a t-shirt. And I decided to add short sleeves to it, regardless of the fact that I probably have enough yarn to add longer sleeves, just because at some point this project started to feel like such a slog and it felt like I wasn't making any progress. I also took it with me as my travel whip, and I was just knitting and knitting and knitting on it. I didn't see anything change. I feel like it took me maybe 2 weeks to finally get to the point where I can split for body and sleeves, and I just needed a win. So I made a decision to go for short sleeves and just cast off after a couple of rounds, and maybe later, if I have enough yarn and I really want to, I can modify it to have long sleeves instead. But so far I have tried it on and I absolutely love how it looks. And this is another project where I'm really loving the darker color and just the vibe it gives me when I try it on. So I'm really excited to finally get through this slog of a body and have it finished, hopefully in time for summer. I'm knitting this in Lamana Premia held double, and as I said, I love this fabric, I love this color, and this yarn is really special and really luxurious. I'm really impressed with the fact that I can stretch 4 balls of this yarn into a finished garment. And the last work in progress is something I only cast on a couple of days ago because it took me a while to find a really special project for this really special yarn. So an absolute unparalleled highlight from my trip to Cologne was meeting Erica from Yarnicopia and Elsa from We Are Wool People in person, and I love these women. They're amazing. They're so passionate about knitting and just so cool to be around. Let's just say we had an amazing time, and a lot of wine and cocktails were involved, but we also exchanged gifts with Erica, and I brought her something from Ukraine, and she in turn brought me a really special yarn from Australia. She brought me a skein of Tarndi wool in fingering weight, and it's the most Australian yarn you can think of. They've had the same flock of sheep since the mid-19th century, and I think it's called Polwarth wool, but knowing English, it's probably pronounced Leicester, so I'm not really sure. I was just blown away by how soft and drapey this is. To be honest, when I first looked at it, I assumed that it would be more rustic, but there's just nothing scratchy or like irritating about this yarn. It's super lightweight and like really cloudy, which I'm not usually expecting from just wools. So this skein has a little less than 400 meters in it, which means that it's perfect for a shawl or maybe a hat, but I couldn't wait until winter to work with this yarn, so I tried to come up with the perfect shawl pattern to knit with it. And I ended up choosing a free pattern called the Jakobe Shawl, or maybe it's not Jakobe, maybe it's just Jacob, but I don't really know which language I'm aiming for. And in any case, this is such an underrated free pattern. It asks for more meterage than what I had, but I decided to stretch out this yarn and still make a large shawl using the Mohair I showed you when I talked about the Norma sweater. As I said, this has been in my stash for a while, so it's a miracle that I somehow found 2 projects to use this yarn in like a span of less than a month. And the cool thing about it is that it's really similar to this wool, but not exactly the same. So it has a really slight contrast. And I decided that since that shawl combines panels of garter stitch and lace, I would knit the lace section in the mohair and keep the garter stitch in this squishy wool. And I really love the result. I wasn't really sure about it at first, but now I'm really kind of vibing with it. And I completely forgot that this mohair is actually variegated. So it goes from brown and beige to this like really deep rust color. And at first, because it's pretty thin, I tried to knit it with 2 strands held together, but it was way too fluffy compared to the wool. So what I did instead, because unfortunately in one strand it was much too thin, I added a really weird like spool of thread I had. I have no idea where this came from. It kind of looks like those nylon threads you add to socks to reinforce the heel, and I have about 4 spools of this, so I think I'll have enough to mix with the mohair. It's really seamless there. You can't really see this extra strand, but it adds enough kind of structure to the mohair that it's not too slippery to knit with, or it's not too see-through in the actual fabric. And obviously this wool is to die for. It's so soft and so squishy in garter stitch, and I love how it's coming out. I feel like I have enough to make it pretty large, and also this is the first time I'm knitting a shawl in this specific shape. I usually go for a more kind of straight angle and more standard shawls that are knit top down, starting from the very small amount of stitches at the beginning and then increased in this like T shape. But here there's a more sharp angle at the beginning, and you actually increase 2 stitches here and then decrease 1 stitch on the opposite side, so your fabric is kind of biasing. It's a really cool effect. I've never knit something like this before, so it's really fun to again try out something new. My co-host decided to join us towards the end, but I don't think she has much to add to this conversation, and I'm not sure if I should wrap this up now, considering that it's going to get dark soon, or maybe show you some of the yarns I also have from the HH trip. Let's maybe do a quick rapid fire acquisition section. So another yarn I got from Rosarios is their Alvor linen and wool blend, which is super unique. But to be honest, I'm kind of on the fence about this yarn because multiple people have said to me that this is the most beautiful yarn they've ever seen and that they really love these linen flecks. But I don't know how I feel about this yet. I tried to swatch with this yarn, and this is my swatch on 3.75mm needles. And while I was knitting this, I was a bit annoyed with the linen flecks, but also I feel like it gives you a really interesting fabric, and it's going to be really fun to incorporate into a summer garment. And the last summer yarn I have from Rosarios is their barrette silk, and it's called Madragoa. And it's just a classic barrette silk. It's really soft and has this beautiful luster in the sunlight. And I have some hand-dyed barrette silk in my stash that is a perfect match for this in terms of weight, and I feel like I need to pair these somehow just to combine the 2 beautiful silks I have, because I also feel like these 2 colors really match each other. I also ended up with a lot of samples of minis from Amano Yarns, and this is a brand which mostly has Peruvian wool and alpacas and, you know, things like that. It's really cool, and they also have vicuña, if I'm not mistaken. And I just have these random minis, which I'm not sure what I'm gonna do with. I'm probably just gonna use it as samples for, again, when I'm doing my roundups and I need some yarn to swatch and like see if it will work for a specific project. And the last sample I got from Amano is their Duna yarn, and I've never seen a cotton alpaca blend before, so I'm really curious to swatch with this yarn and just see how it behaves. I'm also curious if it's gonna become stiffer as cotton usually does after blocking. I also visited a Cologne yarn store called Garn Store appropriately, and I picked up some alpaca too from Isager, which is a yarn I really miss here in Ukraine just because we have some other Isager yarns that are available for just online purchase, but alpaca too for some reason is not one of them. And I was really pressed for time when I was in that store, so I just grabbed the color I liked the most, and this is the color number 60, and it's this beautiful, beautiful pale plum, and I can't wait to start knitting with this. But the thing is, the project I initially envisioned for this turned out to be much too thin to knit. I just forgot how thin this yarn is in a single strand, and I can only comfortably knit with it on like 2.5 millimeter needles, so it's just way too thin for me to knit a t-shirt or maybe a blouse with. I can definitely get through it if I need to, but it's just not going to be a pleasant knitting experience. So after a couple of failed swatches, I gave up and bought the matching silk mohair for it, and this is also in the color 60, and they look so beautiful together. This shade of mohair has a beautiful silvery silk strand, which adds so much dimension to the fabric. And I feel like now my pool of patterns I can choose for this yarn, or this yarn combo more accurately, is much larger just because I can knit this from like 3 millimeter needles to even 4.5. So unless I'm forgetting something, these are all of my acquisitions from the trip. And of course, I'm going to talk more about these yarns once I actually start knitting with them. And I guess that's all for this video. So thank you so much for spending this time with me. If you like this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more. And if you'd like to support my channel directly or buy me a cup of coffee, I have my PayPal linked in the description. Please let me know in the comments what are you working on right now. I'll be really curious to know, and I wish you happy knitting, a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.